On the night of May 28, 1453, a small gate in the northern stretch of Constantinople's land walls stood unlocked. It was called the Kerkoporta, a minor poster meant for sorties, not for anyone's defense. Someone had used it hours earlier and, in the chaos, never sealed it again. Nobody in the city yet understood what that single unlocked gate was about to cost them. The story most people know is simple and satisfying. A 1,000-year-old wall, the strongest fortification in the medieval world, finally cracked under the largest cannons ever built, and an ancient empire felt a superior firepower. It's a clean story. It is a villain, a weapon, and a wall. It is also, according to the actual timeline, missing almost everything that mattered. Rewind 14 years before that gate was left open. In 1439, the Byzantine emperor, desperate for military help against the rising Ottoman threat, traveled to Italy and signed a union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, promising doctrinal submission to Rome in exchange for Western troops and ships. The promise of soldiers largely never arrived. The promise of resentment inside Constantinople arrived immediately and stayed. The city that stood behind those famous walls in 1453 was not the Constantinople of legend. At its height under Justinian, it held perhaps 500,000 people. By the time of the siege, historians estimate the population had fallen to somewhere between 40 and 50,000, rattling around inside a fortification system built to shelter 10 times that number. That number matters more than any cannon. The Theodosian walls stretched for 4 miles, requiring, by contemporary military estimate, thousands of trained defenders spaced along their length to hold them properly. Emperor Constantine XI could field roughly 7,000 men, a large fraction of them foreign mercenaries, to defend a perimeter built for an army several times that size. Those defenders weren't even a unified force. Venetian sailors, Genoese soldiers under a commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, and a small corps of Byzantine troops all answered to overlapping chains of command, each with their own government's interests back home. The city wasn't just undermanned. It was defended by a coalition that had never trained together and didn't fully trust each other. While Constantinople negotiated, prayed, and waited for ships that weren't coming, the young sultan who would besiege it was doing something almost nobody in the city took seriously. Mehmed II had inherited the Ottoman throne at 19, and by every account from his own court, the conquest of Constantinople wasn't a wartime opportunity for him. It was an obsession he'd carried since childhood, studied in military histories and engineering manuals long before he had the army to act on it. In the 2 years before the siege, Mehmed built an entirely new fortress, Rumeli Hisari, directly across the Bosphorus from an older Ottoman fort, giving him total control over the strait and the ability to strangle any grain shipment reaching the city from the Black Sea before a single cannon had even fired. This wasn't a young ruler rushing into battle. This was a decade of patient preparation aimed at one target, while that target assumed it still had time. Here's the detail almost nobody includes when they tell this story, and it's the detail that changes everything. The engineer behind those famous Ottoman cannons wasn't Ottoman. His name was Orban, a Hungarian gunsmith, and he offered his services to Constantinople first, proposing to build the emperor a weapon capable of leveling any wall in Europe. Constantine XI couldn't pay him. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The imperial treasury, drained by decades of shrinking trade revenue and the collapse of Byzantine control over its own tax-generating territory, didn't have the funds to hire the one engineer who might have altered the balance of the siege before it even began. Orban left for the Ottoman court instead, where Sultan Mehmed II paid him immediately. What Orban built for his new patron is worth picturing properly, because canon undersells it. His largest gun, later nicknamed Basilica, reportedly measured over 26 feet long, needed 60 oxen and hundreds of men to haul into position, and fired stone balls weighing over half a ton, each shot taking hours to reload and cool before the crew could fire again. It took weeks just to transport it to the walls. Sit with that for a moment, because it's the actual hinge of this entire story. The empire didn't lose a technology race because Ottoman engineering was superior. It lost a bidding war for a single freelance engineer because a 1,000-year-old treasury had been quietly bankrupt for longer than anyone in power wanted to admit out loud. The financial collapse behind that bankruptcy didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen because of one bad emperor. Byzantine trade revenue, once drawn from controlling routes between Europe and Asia, had been steadily captured by Venetian and Genoese merchants operating under treaties the empire itself had signed generations earlier. Trading long-term economic control for short-term military favors it usually didn't even receive. By the 1450s, the Byzantine state survived largely on customs revenue from a capital city with a fraction of its former population, taxing merchant ships that increasingly belonged to the same Italian city-states who were supposedly Constantinople's allies. The empire had spent 2 centuries slowly handing its own economic engine to outsiders in exchange for promises of protection that kept arriving late, small, or not at all. When Mehmed II's forces arrived outside the walls in early April 1453, the siege that followed lasted 53 days, not 53 minutes. Here's the second myth worth dismantling: that the city simply gave up under the weight of superior firepower. It didn't. Ottoman assaults were repelled again and again, and contemporary accounts describe Ottoman losses so heavy that members of Mehmed's own council reportedly urged him to consider withdrawing. The famous cannons, enormous as they were, needed hours to cool and reload between shots, and the defenders repaired breaches nightly with timber, earth, and whatever the depleted city could still spare from its shrinking stockpiles. For weeks, 7,000 men held 4 miles of wall against the largest siege army Europe had seen in a generation, and it very nearly worked. This is where the third forgotten mechanism enters the story, and it has nothing to do with gunpowder. The Golden Horn, the harbor protecting the city's sea-facing walls, was blocked by a massive iron chain the Byzantines had stretched across its entrance, preventing Ottoman ships from entering and forcing any naval assault into a much narrower, better defended stretch of water. Mehmed's solution wasn't a bigger weapon. It was logistics. He had his engineers build a greased wooden track overland behind the peninsula and had dozens of ships hauled across dry land at night to bypass the chain entirely, launching them directly into the previously protected harbor. The defenders woke to an Ottoman fleet inside water they believed sealed shut. That single logistical maneuver, not a cannon, forced Constantinople's already stretched defenders to cover an even longer stretch of vulnerable wall with no additional men to spare. The city wasn't outgunned into submission. It was outmaneuvered by an opponent solving a supply and access problem faster than a starved treasury, and an undersized garrison could adapt to it. 10 days before the final assault, something happened that had nothing to do with strategy at all, and everything to do with morale. On the night of May 22nd, the moon rose in full eclipse over the besieged city, darkening slowly until it hung a deep, bloodless red above the walls. An old prophecy held that Constantinople could never fall while the moon shone full and bright above it. Soldiers who had held their positions through 5 weeks of bombardment, who hadn't broken under stone shot the size of millstones, stood on the walls that night and watched the sky itself seem to withdraw its protection. Contemporary chroniclers describe processions through the streets, icons carried past the walls, prayers offered by men who had nothing left to trust but omens, because the ships from the west still hadn't come. By late May, exhaustion did what cannon fire alone couldn't. On the night of the final assault, that unlocked postern gate, the Kerkoporta, was discovered by a small Ottoman detachment, who slipped through it and raised their banner on an interior tower before the main walls had even been breached. Word spread inward faster than the truth could catch it, and defenders elsewhere, seeing a flag flying behind their own lines, believed the city had already fallen. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander holding the critical land wall sector, was wounded and evacuated, and his section collapsed within the hour. Constantine XI is said to have torn off his imperial regalia so he wouldn't be recognized and captured, choosing to die fighting among ordinary soldiers instead. Nobody was ever confirmed as his. The last Roman emperor, a title stretching back over 14 centuries, disappeared into an unmarked crowd of the dead. The record, once you line it up, looks nothing like the myth. The walls, undermanned by a factor of 10, held against direct bombardment for 53 days. The city's actual defeat came from an unpaid engineer, a bankrupt treasury, a bypassed harbor chain, a broken omen, and one unlocked gate discovered in the dark. Not from a wall that finally gave in to a bigger gun. Go back to that gate one more time, sitting open in the dark while defenders elsewhere still held their ground against direct assault. It wasn't a symbol of military failure. It was the smallest, most literal expression of a much larger truth. An empire that has quietly run out of money for a century eventually runs out of people to watch every door, no matter how thick its walls are. Modern organizations run the same math without noticing, funding today's emergency by cutting tomorrow's maintenance, choosing the cheaper option instead of the one who could actually solve the problem, assuming the perimeter will hold because it always has. Nobody declares that kind of decline. It accumulates quietly until a single unlocked door turns out to be exactly where the whole structure was thinnest. So the question worth asking isn't whether Constantinople's walls could have held against better cannons, because for 53 days, they nearly did. The question is what happens to any system, ancient or modern, when it keeps choosing the cheaper answer for 200 years and calls it stability, right up until the night someone finds the one door nobody thought to lock. If you love exploring ancient enigmas like this, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation.